Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's topic, it's something I've talked about extensively because I talk about superhero stuff a lot. I literally just finished a video recording like a minute ago where I talked about superheroes to a certain extent, but nevertheless, basically this is going back to the subject of connected universes. This applies to the MCU and the Arrowverse because them specifically because of what they represent. Like there's a lot of other things that kind of fall under the same line of like connected universe, especially like TV show wise and stuff like that. It's like you have your Law and Orders, your like Chicago Fire, PD, Med, so on and so forth, stuff like that. But this particularly applies to the MCU and the Arrowverse because they're connected universes that I feel like you can't just jump into. Like at this point in time, we are still a couple movies away, but we're nearing like the climax of this whole like MCU situation before like Avengers 4, and then it's going to be like a sort of reset is kind of how like I've interpreted like the way people have kind of described the whole situation. But nevertheless, it's like the MCU isn't one of those situations you can kind of jump into. Like certain situations, sure, first in a lot of movie series I guess you could jump into without there being too much of an issue. You still be kind of lost in a greater universe because everything is connected. There'll be references to stuff like, oh, if you haven't seen this previous movie, you might not get that. Like, oh, that's something they've set up and they make a joke about it, and it's like everyone's laughing. It's like, well, what are they laughing about? Oh, that's something I didn't get because I've only just jumped into this movie. Like a great example is compared, like, as I think as an example I've used before, is if you've randomly, like, this is back when Civil War came out. Like Civil War, I feel like isn't a movie that you can enjoy as much if you had not seen the previous movies. It's kind of like going from like seeing the Iron Man movie to seeing Avengers. It's like, wait, what? Because you didn't watch Thor or Captain America before like watching that. You know, it's an example like that. That if you only saw like a few handful of the Marvel movies at that point in time and you just skip to like Civil War, you're gonna be lost because so much of that movie is just big payoff from what had happened. Like all the previous movies are culminating to that one moment of everyone turning against each other. Like it has action scenes, but I think what really drives that movie is the fact of the matter is of all the setup that led up to that point. And I feel like if you don't know the characters, if you don't understand the dynamics between them, it would make the movie like a lot less enjoyable. It's like Civil War is hands down one of my favorite MCU movies just because of that aspect. But there's certain ones kind of like Spider-Man Homecoming, for example, or like Doctor Strange. You could dive into those, but it's still one of those situations of like, if you haven't dived in, like if you're going to start those, like jump into this whole MCU thing, you would have to start it from the beginning, which might be too much for a lot of people. And that turns into that question of like, is these connected universes too much? Is a subject I've brought up before in the past, but is it something that you feel like a lot can lend itself to other genres as well? Because obviously there's the whole Dooku situation where they were trying to set up their own cinematic universe type of thing. But is that something that you feel like is something you would want more things to do, or is it like a situation of like, no, leave it to them, the superheroes, they can kind of do that whole situation. Me, I don't want that. Another good example would be like taking the Arrowverse, for example, is Legends of Tomorrow. You would have to have watched Arrow and Flash before you watch Legends of Tomorrow. I talked about this extensively when I was bringing up the nerd mode. Legends of Tomorrow is born from the setup of Arrow and Flash because it involves characters from Arrow and Flash. Even if you are very, very well versed in comic books, it's still a situation that you should watch Arrow and Flash because these particular characters' backgrounds are very different from who they are in the comic books. For example, like White Canary is Sarah Lance in Legends of Tomorrow. That's not the case in the comic books because it's just because like, oh, Sarah was originally the Black Canary and then eventually became the White Canary, because also it was Laurel who was the Black Canary from the very beginning, always in the comic books. But it's like Sarah started off as a Black Canary in Arrow, and then eventually Laurel took, you know, over as a Black Canary for her. So, and which even now is kind of spoilers, but Dinah has picked up, you know, the Black Canary moniker. But because that whole show is built around setup from another show, because you never get to like, oh man, like, oh, who are the legends, understanding and knowing who they are, you'd have to watch the other shows, which me as someone who's a big fan of the other shows, it's no big deal because like I already put in the time, I already watched it from the beginning. The same thing applies for the MCU. I don't have to worry about like, oh man, like I kind of, it's like, no, I've enjoyed every movie, and then with the Arrowverse, every TV show up to this point in time. So for me, it's not added homework, but for someone else, it's like, well, what if I don't like Green Arrow, so I skipped over Arrow and just only watched the Flash, you know? Or, you know, maybe I don't like Arrow or Flash, I like Legends, but it's a situation that, like, if you haven't watched those other shows, I am a little confused. So it's still something I feel like you could enjoy, but I feel like you'd enjoy it so much more, you'd understand it even more, understand where everyone is coming from if you've watched your previous shows, is kind of what I'm getting at. And the same thing with the MCU. It's because everything was built out. They had this plan that's going into its 10th year. I mean, but even amongst those connected universes, there are outliers where it's like with the MCU, you have all those Netflix shows that kind of do their own thing as well. And even have Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D, which kind of does its own thing as well. But then again, it's still that aspect of, because it is a connected universe, there is probably limitations to what they can do. But at the same time, it's like there is a disconnect that you are able to kind of like do your own thing with it, you know, because of the whole Marvel TV show and movies disconnect. But there's also the aspect of taking the Arrowverse, for example, is you have Supergirl. Supergirl is a great example of that whole connected universe, but still doing its own thing. So out of any of the like Arrowverse stuff, I feel like you could probably, and maybe they're going to set Black Lightning up to be like that too, as the fact is you can just watch it by itself, because Supergirl only crosses over with the other shows. At this point in time, it's only crossed over 3 times. There was the Heroes versus Alien crossover between all 4 shows. There was also the Flash and Supergirl crossover musical episode, and now there's the once again all 4 shows crossing over in the Crisis on Earth X situation. But that's 3 crossovers amongst all the different times like Flash and Arrow has crossover back and forth. I'm sure Legends of Tomorrow has had more crossovers too. But just because Supergirl takes place on a different Earth, it gives it that little more freedom. But then again, like you compare like the Netflix Marvel shows and even Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D, that all takes place in the same world as the MCU movie. It still brings up the question of like, is that too much? Once again, like, would that lend itself to other TV shows? Once again, I brought up like the Law and Order, for example. Like Law and Order is all in the same universe, but they kind of play around with a little bit more, because for one, that's a grounded show where it doesn't have like, you can keep these, their stories are small and isolated. They're not big world impacting things like a superhero genre. So maybe everything can take place in the same universe. Maybe things will be a little bit easier, like in a connected universe. It's like, you know, kind of using the MCU as an example, and even the X-Men, like, because you compare like the X-Men movies to the TV shows like The Gifted and Legion, they're not too specific about like dates and time, because like, well, because it gives it a little more opportunities to kind of mess with the continuity a little bit, because especially because like the X-Men movies and stuff like that have kind of specified dates and years and stuff like that. So I guess this gives you more time to be like, you don't have to specify where in the timeline this takes place. It just takes place in that kind of universe. Kind of the same thing with the Netflix show. It's kind of like they're their own thing, because they are, for one, smaller stories in this grand scheme of a thing. Then maybe it allows more wiggle room. Like taking Spider-Man Homecoming, for example. Spider-Man, in my opinion, is probably like the smallest story in the MCU. It is kind of like connected to the MCU as a whole in certain aspects of like what kind of gave motivation to the main villain, as well as, you know, Tony being a part of the movie, which obviously that's not a spoiler because it's all over the trailers. Once again, ultimately my question is, what do you think about the whole grand scheme of these connected universes? Do you think it is too much, that you feel like this shouldn't go beyond what it is? Like, even at this point in time, you're like, I put too much time. It's just, there's too much in like these connected universe that basically I have to see everything, even though I might not have any interest in it. So do you feel like it's a genre, a setup that you feel like you don't ever want to see applied to anything else? Or are you like, no, I enjoy this aspect, it's such a unique aspect because it is something that not everyone is doing, I would like to see maybe something else do it? Or do you feel like it should stay where it is, superhero stuff? Because these superhero movies and TV shows are based on comic books that originally started off as material that is connected with one another. Do you think that changes your opinion about the aspect of a connected universe? All these different movie series coming together to create this cinematic universe or televised universe in Arrowverse's case. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below. I'm very curious to know your opinions about this. But really, that's all I want to talk about in this episode. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.